There was a time when the people of Israel were paralyzed by fear. The days dawned with tension, and the nights fell like a cloak of uncertainty. The valley of Elah, which separated the armies of Israel and the Philistines, became the scene of a silent war, where no swords were raised, but terror grew with each passing morning. Among the Philistine soldiers there was a man who needed no army to cause panic. His name was Goliath, and his figure seemed to come from an ancient nightmare. He came from the city of Gath, one of the regions where descendants of the giants of antiquity still survived. His height exceeded any human standard. He was like a living tower, covered in heavy, gleaming bronze armor, with a spear that looked more like the shaft of a loom. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. With every step he took, the ground seemed to shake. With every word he uttered, the hearts of the Israelites faltered. Goliath was not just a warrior. He was a symbol, a cruel reminder that Israel was being tested, not only in its military strength, but in its faith. Saul's soldiers, once so brave, began to retreat in the presence of the giant. Even the king, a tall man chosen to lead, hesitated to act. Courage was being undermined by fear, and hope seemed to fade amid the murmurs and lost looks in the camp. Goliath appeared every day. Like a grim clock, he descended into the valley and issued his challenge. His voice, laden with contempt, cut through the silence and wounded deeper than any sword. He mocked Israel and their God, offering one-on-one combat, but no one dared to step forward. In that landscape marked by discouragement, the shadow of the giant covered everything, and for 40 days it reigned over God's people. The tension grew, and Israel's faith seemed on the verge of collapse. But while the eyes of men were fixed on the stature of the enemy, God's gaze was already resting elsewhere, on someone unexpected, still far from that field. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment on which city or country you are watching from. Let's see how far this message is reaching. Goliath was not just tall. He was the embodiment of everything that intimidated: strength, experience, and boundless confidence. His body was shaped by the battlefield. From a young age, he had lived among wars, sharpening his senses, strengthening his muscles, learning to master fear or ignore it. He was a man trained to kill, and he enjoyed it. His armor was almost impenetrable. A bronze helmet covered his head. On his body, he wore a breastplate that weighed almost as much as an ordinary man. Every piece of his clothing was designed to make him invincible. His movements were slow but steady. Every step carried the certainty that no one could stop him. In addition to his appearance and strength, Goliath possessed something even more destructive: blind confidence in himself. He mocked with ease. He ridiculed without fear. He feared nothing and no one. He considered himself superior to everyone, including the God of Israel. In his eyes, there was no reverence, no doubt, no compassion, only contempt for those he considered inferior. The spear he carried was gigantic. The iron tip alone weighed more than many entire shields. In front of him walked a squire, clearing the way, as if Goliath himself were a force of nature, impossible to stop, unreachable, unbeatable. Faced with such a presence, the army of Israel saw no alternative. It was as if every man knew he would be destroyed if he tried to face him. With each passing day, hope diminished. Silence took hold of the ranks. Humiliation was visible on their faces, and yet no one moved. The Philistines knew what they had in Goliath, and they trusted him to win without even having to fight an entire war. A single battle would suffice. One man against the giant. That was the proposal. A cruel game in which defeat would mean slavery. But what no one realized was that behind all this grandeur lay the same mistake made by so many others who had challenged the God of Israel: pride. And even giants fall when they believe too much in their own strength. Every morning before the sun warmed the valley, Goliath was already there. He marched with heavy steps to the center of the field and raised his voice, issuing his challenge before Israel. His words, sharp as swords, wounded the spirit of the people. He not only called for battle, he insulted. He mocked Saul's army. He mocked the God of Israel, and no one responded. For 40 days, this scene was repeated. 40 mornings of fear, 40 afternoons of shame. Goliath did not just provoke, he dominated the atmosphere with his presence. His laughter echoed through the hills. His contempt was evident. Each of his words seemed to push the Israelites further into themselves, immersed in the humiliation of having no one to represent them. Saul, the king who had been chosen because of his height and warrior-like appearance, remained silent in his tent. His generals avoided looking the soldiers in the eye. No one dared to step forward. Fear had taken root in their hearts like a twisted tree, difficult to uproot. And the longer the silence reigned, the more Goliath grew in arrogance. He knew he was winning, even without fighting. He was demoralizing an entire people. He didn't need to use his spear. His words were enough. Confidence in his own strength made him believe he was invincible. And worse, it made others believe it too. The Israelite camp, once so vibrant with prayers and war songs, was now a place of murmurs and heavy sighs. Each new day was a repeat of the previous one, and the soldiers counted the time with anguish, hoping that something or someone would change that story. But no one expected the change to come from outside the battlefield. No one imagined that while Goliath shouted from the valley, a young shepherd was tending sheep in Bethlehem, far from that grim scene. Someone who sought neither war nor glory, someone whose heart burned for God, even without knowing what awaited him. If this content is touching your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. Your support helps me to continue telling these stories with dedication. While the days repeated themselves in the valley of Elah in Bethlehem, life followed a different rhythm. David, the youngest of Jesse's sons, did not wield swords or shields. His world was the open field, the peaceful hills, the sound of sheep, and the music that flowed from his harp. He was a young man with a sensitive heart, attentive eyes, and a courageous spirit, although no one saw him that way. Jesse, his father, one day called him with a simple task: to take food to his brothers who were in the army and bring back news of them. David obeyed promptly. He got up early, left the sheep in the care of another shepherd, and set off for the battlefield, unaware that this would be the day that would change his history, and that of Israel. Upon arriving at the camp, David was surprised by the gloomy atmosphere. He expected to find an army ready and excited, but instead he saw soldiers with their heads down and tense. Conversations were muffled, and eyes avoided the horizon. Fear was palpable. Soon, David saw his brothers, but before he could talk to them, he heard a different sound, a hoarse, defiant voice coming from the valley. He approached, and then saw him, Goliath. The giant stood in the center of the field, once again issuing his challenge. David stood still for a moment, listening to every word. It was not the man's size that impressed him, nor his armor. It was the scorn in his voice as he insulted the God of Israel. Something stirred within David. As the soldiers moved away, David approached. He asked who that man was and why he was still standing there, challenging the army of the living God. The soldiers looked at him strangely. Some laughed. Others tried to silence him, but he continued. It bothered him deeply. His own brothers rebuked him, saying he was just a curious, meddlesome boy. But David was not offended. His gaze remained fixed on the valley. He had not come there by chance. Although he did not know it, he had been led by God to the exact place where he needed to be. David felt no fear. He felt something different, a kind of indignation that came from within, not out of pride, but out of reverence. What moved him was not a desire for glory or to prove something to someone. It was the burning discomfort of seeing God's name being profaned and no one doing anything about it. He walked around the camp and asked the soldiers what would be given to the man who defeated Goliath, but his questions went beyond curiosity. They carried a veiled provocation. How can you allow this to continue? Where is your faith? It was an affront to widespread cowardice, and few knew how to respond. David's words began to attract attention. Soon they reached the ears of King Saul. Curious and perhaps desperate, Saul sent for the young man. When David entered his tent, Saul saw a face without the wrinkles of war, with hands calloused from the field, not from battle. And he heard something that surprised him. David offered to face the giant. Saul tried to dissuade him. He said he was just a boy, untrained and inexperienced. But David told him about his secret victories, the ones no one had seen. He remembered the times when, while tending the sheep, he had faced lions and bears. He did not fight out of his own courage, but out of trust. He knew that God had delivered him before and would deliver him again. This was not just a brave shepherd. This was a heart full of faith, a young man who saw beyond appearances. To him, Goliath was not invincible. He was just a man who dared to challenge the Most High God. And that David could not accept. There was something pure in his indignation. He wasn't seeking a place in the palace, nor did he want to impress soldiers. His soul burned for justice, for honor to the name of the Lord. He knew that victory did not come from swords, but from heaven. And for that, he was ready. Even surrounded by doubt, contempt, and disbelief, David remained steadfast. The giant was big, yes, but greater was the God he served. And when faith is greater than fear, the impossible bows before obedience. Saul, faced with David's steadfastness, finally gave in, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of lack of alternatives. The king offered his own armor to the young shepherd, an attempt to protect him, perhaps even to mold him into the traditional model of a warrior. David tried on each piece, but soon realized that the weight did not belong to him. He had never won with armor. His confidence was not in metal, but in the presence of God. He respectfully returned the armor and went with what he knew, his sling, his bag, and 5 smooth stones that he had carefully chosen from the stream. It was not a reckless choice, but a mature faith, even though he was young. His heart was fearless, not because he was unaware of the danger, but because he fully trusted in the one who sustained him. As the soldiers watched from a distance, perhaps between astonishment and shame, David descended into the valley. His steps were neither hurried nor hesitant. Each one carried purpose. Goliath was already waiting for him, surprised to see that his challenger was not a muscular warrior, but a red-haired, skinny boy. The giant's arrogance overflowed. He mocked David as he mocked everyone else. He said he would treat him like a dog, that he would tear his flesh and feed it to the birds. His words were sharp, but David did not back down. His eyes showed no fear, and his voice responded firmly. Not with threats, but with faith. David was not there on behalf of Saul, nor his brothers, nor himself. He was there on behalf of the Lord of hosts. He did not fight for personal glory, but for divine justice, and that made all the difference. His boldness was not pride, it was conviction. The distance between the two began to shrink. Goliath advanced with his spear. David ran with his sling. It was a clash of two realities, human strength versus unshakable faith. The sound of footsteps echoed among the hills. The armies on both sides held their breath. The dreaded moment had finally arrived. But David did not tremble. His heart was steadfast, and his target was much clearer than any eye could see. The valley fell silent. 2 men approached, one gigantic and covered in bronze, the other simple and agile, with his feet firmly planted on the ground and his eyes turned to the sky. Goliath, with his squire in front, marched as if he already knew the end of the story. David ran lightly, like someone who knows he carries more than stones. The tension was palpable. The air seemed trapped between the hills. No soldier dared to shout. Everyone watched, and in that instant, time seemed to slow down. David reached the center of the valley and without hesitation reached into his bag. His fingers touched the right stone, smooth, firm, carefully chosen. In one swift motion, he placed it in his sling and began to swing it with precision. The sound of leather cutting through the air mingled with Goliath's heavy footsteps. The giant laughed. He still thought it was all an act, an insult. But then, everything changed. The stone flew. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was purpose. It cut through the wind with precision and embedded itself in the giant's exposed forehead, right between the eyes, the only vulnerable spot. The metallic sound of armor hitting the ground echoed through the valley like thunder. Goliath fell. The giant, the symbol of terror, the pride of the Philistines, fell without even using his sword. The army of Israel could hardly believe what they were seeing. The Philistines stood motionless, as if the world had stopped. The impossible had just happened, before everyone's eyes. A shepherd had defeated the champion. A young man had brought down the threat that had lasted 40 days. David ran to the fallen body. With steady hands, he pulled out Goliath's heavy sword, and with a single blow ended what he had started. There was no room for doubt. The victory was clear, definitive. The valley, which for so long had echoed with the giant's voice, was now in absolute silence. But that silence was different. It was the silence of amazement, of admiration, of the awakening of a forgotten faith. Fear had changed sides, and the history of Israel had just gained a new hero, unlikely, but chosen. Goliath's body lay on the ground, inert, heavy, defeated. The dust had not yet settled, and the sound of the fall still echoed among the hills. For a moment, no one moved. The scene was surreal. The giant was dead, not by a spear, nor by an army, but by a boy who trusted in the Lord. The Philistines were the first to react, not with cries of vengeance, but with panic. Terror was stamped on their faces, and they quickly began to run. They fled in despair, throwing their shields and spears to the ground, as if abandoning all their confidence along with their weapons. On the other side, something different was happening. The army of Israel, previously paralyzed by fear, was awakened by the faith of one man. The cries of terror from their enemies became fuel for the courage of the Hebrews. Men who had been hiding behind rocks now ran with renewed strength. The valley, previously filled with silence and fear, was now filled with movement. The Israelites advanced boldly, pursuing the Philistines to their fortified cities. The victory that seemed impossible became a reality. And it all started with a young man who believed more in God than in the threats before him. David took Goliath's head as proof of victory, while his sword and armor became symbols of that unforgettable day. The shepherd's name began to be whispered among the soldiers with admiration and surprise. Who was this young man? Where did such courage come from? The news of the victory would soon reach the ears of all the people, but for David, there was no pride. There was reverence. He knew who had won that battle. He knew he was only an instrument. Goliath's fall was not just a military victory, it was a divine declaration. God was with his people, and it was not the size of the enemy that determined the outcome. On that day, fear lost its power, and Israel remembered that even when all seems lost, a heart surrendered to God is enough to make the impossible happen. David's name went from unknown to revered in a single day. The boy from Bethlehem, who had left the flock to bring bread to his brothers, was now recognized as the young man who had struck down the giant. But his victory was not only personal, it was collective, spiritual, national. It touched the heart of Israel deeply. In the camp, the soldiers' countenance changed. Where once there had been unease, now there was admiration. Many still tried to understand how it had happened. Some said it was luck, others that it was daring. But deep down, everyone knew there was something different about David, something that could not be explained by training or skill. It was faith. When brought before King Saul, David remained the same simple man. He did not demand recognition. He did not ask for rewards. He spoke respectfully but firmly. His confidence remained steadfast, not in himself, but in the God he served. And that, as much as it bothered many, was impossible to ignore. The people began to sing. The songs celebrated the victory and the new hero. But with the songs came the king's uneasiness. Saul saw something in David that he did not understand, and that, little by little, he began to fear. Admiration would soon mix with envy, and the king's heart would never be the same. Still, David did not change. He continued to serve, playing his harp, respecting authority, and taking care of his duties. But he was no longer just the shepherd of the hills. Now he carried the history of a nation. He was remembered as the one who was not intimidated, the one who saw a giant but did not let himself be guided by his eyes, the one who believed. The story of Goliath, told for generations, became a symbol of how God chooses the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. And David, with his sling and a stone, showed that true strength is not in the arm of man, but in the heart that trusts fully in the Lord. The impact of that victory spanned the years. It marked the beginning of a new season in Israel, not just political or military, but spiritual, a vivid reminder that sincere faith can shake even the foundations of fear. The story of Goliath is not just about a giant who fell. It is about the contrast between human confidence and dependence on God, about how pride can grow so much that one forgets one's own fragility, and about how faith, even if simple and young, can move the impossible. Goliath represented more than physical strength. He was a symbol of paralyzing fear, of arrogance that defies God, of intimidation that silences hearts. For 40 days, he dominated the field with his words and presence. But all it took was a heart willing to trust God for everything to change. David shows us that courage is not born of the absence of danger, but of the certainty that God is with us. He did not deny the size of the enemy, but he did not allow that to define his stance. While everyone saw an invincible giant, David saw a challenge to God's holiness, and he could not ignore that. David's victory reveals that God does not need many, nor does he need human power. He uses the unlikely, the despised, the small, as long as they are available and faithful. What defeated Goliath was not a stone, but the faith behind it. And that remains true today. In the Christian life, we face giants in various forms: fears, addictions, traumas, pressures from the world, voices that diminish us. Many of them rise up every day and try to convince us that we are incapable, that we are alone. But the story of David and Goliath reminds us that we do not need to win with our weapons. We just need to stand in faith, knowing that the battle belongs to the Lord. What God seeks is not perfection, titles, or appearance. He seeks whole hearts, which trust even when everyone else retreats, which make themselves available even without understanding everything, which say yes even when they seem the smallest among their brothers. Goliath fell because someone believed more in God than in logic, and that remains the key to victory: living faith, humble courage, and obedience to the call. Giants still fall. God still raises up Davids. If you like the story of Goliath and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.